이어지는 강연도 역시 비슷한 맥락의 강의입니다. 지금부터 모실 연자분을 소개해드리면 아만다 미셸 가디언 글로벌 디렉터님이신데요. 이분은 가디언의 독자 수익을 관리하는 부서에서 글로벌 디렉터로서 계십니다. 그래서 담당하고 계신 게 가디언의 글로벌 수익, 또 뉴스 콘텐츠 전략, 또 성장 앞으로의 미래 성장 전략 등을 책임지고 계신데요. 지난해에 가디언은 후원자 100만 명을 확보했다고 해요. 그래서 지금 현재 그 독자 후원 모델을 강화해 나가고 있는데 이분이 어떤 방식으로 접근해서 가디언의 이렇게 후원 모델의 성공을 이끌어내셨는지에 대해서 발표를 해주시겠습니다. 다시 한번 큰 박수 보내주시죠.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me here. I'm very much appreciative to your generous and gracious hospitality. I've had a fantastic time at this event and very much appreciate too the opportunity to learn what's happening here in South Korea. I'm going to return with many notes and also a new envy of the new Neek mascot. I sent these emails back to my colleagues last night with lots of photos and pointing out, cute, look how cute it is. And they were all trying to make sense of what I meant by that. So thank you. So I'm going to tell you a story about The Guardian. And I think in this context, with so much discussion about new media, it's worth underscoring The Guardian is an almost 200-year-old news organization. And it has, in effect, bucked the paywall trend and forged its own model during tumultuous times. And I suspect we're often asked to tell our story because people see us as having made a risky decision in risky times. And it's true, the times are really uncertain. Uncertain political times, uncertain times for journalism, uncertain times for democracy, uncertain times for the public sphere. And that's before we even consider how both technology and the climate crisis are disrupting the trajectory of our lives and our societies. And for some that's exhilarating and others exhausting, but certainly the backdrop of the story today. So, in North America and Europe, journalism has struggled to support itself financially. And in the case of The Guardian, the situation was very severe. So 3 years ago, our annual operating losses were £57 million. 2 years ago, they were 38 million. And then 19 million. This year, we announced that we had finally broken even with the support of 1 million readers around the globe. And I'm going to explain how our reader revenue model came to be, what it is, and why it matters to us. But I have a bit of a warning here. It is a story, not the story, and my team and myself are one small part of this larger effort. And I'll focus on the aspect that I know best, which is our emerging reader revenue model, specifically the role of contributions and membership. I'm the global director for contributions, and over the last 4 years, I've been deputy executive editor for membership, a product manager for contributions and membership, and together with my team, we grew voluntary support from just 12,000 individuals to more than 300,000 members and more than 500,000 contributors. I think in this event, it has extra meaning for me. The Guardian is actually the first legacy institution that I have ever worked at. I got my start in journalism working at new media startups. And so I think this story of The Guardian is as much about the revenue model as it is about an organizational change, one that I might be more sensitive to having come from more of a new media startup culture. I believe, though, that we've found an answer for us and a model that works for The Guardian. I'm actually not here to convince you that this is what you should do, that this is the answer for you. I know that's sometimes implied in a talk like this. As soon as you do something different, you're expected to advocate for it. But my hope actually is that organizations will forge their own paths, explore ideas and approaches that work best for them, their audiences, and their communities, and essentially to figure out what makes them special and build from there. And telling people to think about what makes them special can come across as a little glib or cheesy, but if you think about it in the past, I think media sometimes, just thought what was special was about geography or a certain specialization like the topic. But now, given how diverse media has become, that specialty is so much more nuanced and there's so much more possibility. I don't think it's something that you should assume. It's something you should obsess over. And I was thinking about this yesterday while listening to the very inspiring founders of Uppity and Nunik two very unique sites with their own rationale. And both, founders, I think, were telling us all in different ways how they were obsessing over their audience, how they were trying to serve their unique needs. And what was fascinating to me is their model, much like ours, I think much like Mediapart's, emerges out of a desire to serve a specific audience and to tell certain kinds of stories. And where I come from, I'm from the States. We often talk about journalism at conferences in really broad terms, but it is a diverse industry, small and large, nonprofit, commercial, independent and not, video, print, etc. And I think for an industry as diverse as journalism, there's room for diversity of approach. So, now on to the story. So today, The Guardian is one of the biggest English language news organizations in the world. Our headquarters is in London, and we have newsrooms too in Manchester, England, New York, and Sydney, Australia. There are correspondents around the globe. There's a bit of history as well. The Guardian began in 1821 as the Manchester Guardian following the Peterloo Massacre. It was political and progressive from the start, and now, almost more than 200 years later, we serve a massive audience of more than 150 million. We cover politics, the environment, sports, lifestyle, arts, and science, and more. There are books and art and music and film reviews, recipes too. Many know us for our investigations, like Cambridge Analytica, Paradise Papers, Panama Papers, Snowden. Our newsroom is led by Editor-in-Chief Catherine Viner, and in 2017, she published a piece called A Mission for Journalism in a Time of Crisis. I recommend it. And in it, she laid out 5 principles for our newsroom and our news organization to guide our reporting and work. These principles are meant to embody our journalistic values and ambitions. They're meant to steer our editorial agenda and our institutional mission. So they are, we will develop ideas that will improve the world. We will collaborate with readers and others. We will diversify to have richer reporting and a more representative newsroom. We will be meaningful in our work, and we will report fairly on people as well as power. Those principles are meant to serve as a moral compass to our journalists. I joined The Guardian nearly 8 years ago while living in New York, and I joined without being that familiar with The Guardian's history, and quickly learned of one figure who has played an immense and outsized role, the editor C.P. Scott. He was The Guardian's editor from 1872 to 1927, and then the owner of The Guardian from 1907 onwards. And the 5 principles that I read to you earlier build on centuries of editors' guidance, including his, who wrote, "A newspaper has a moral as well as a material existence." A newspaper has a moral as well as a material existence. I think that one line by Scott underscores why it's worth deliberating over a news organization's business model, why it's worth deliberating over the mission at stake. So we wanted a business model that would work in support of our mission, that shared our values. We began from the position that we wanted to keep our journalism open and available to everyone. Over the last decade, our audience has grown dramatically to more than 150 million, 2/3 of our audience being outside of the United Kingdom. And the audience is outside of the United Kingdom, like the audience in the US that I'm familiar with, has a very different connection with the publication. The UK audience knows of The Guardian's history, whereas the audience in the US is much more recent. It's much more casual in its nature. We wanted a revenue model that would work across the many geographies of readership. Colleagues also assessed the prospects of a paywall model, but the early projections were not promising enough. In our newsroom, we have long valued engagement with readers. They are the source of stories and feedback. They are the readers that we serve, and it was important to us that our revenue model never jeopardize that relationship nor trust. And much like the Center for Investigative Journalism, we place tremendous value on serving both the broader public and the constituencies affected by our stories, wanting to make sure that they too can read the reporting that we produce. And lastly, but very significantly, there is our ownership model. So C.P. Scott, the editor I told you about, also established the Scott Trust, and he transferred the ownership of The Guardian to it earlier in the century. The trust protects our editorial independence. The revenues go directly into supporting the journalism, not into someone's back pocket. We do not have shareholders to satisfy. So those 4 factors, an initial business review, the opportunities afforded by our ownership structure, the Scott Trust, a desire to stay open, and our values are what set us off on, I think, both a difficult and hopeful quest for a revenue model. And the model we have landed on is a simple one. We have what we call a mixed model. On one side, you have advertising and reader revenues on the other. The essence of the reader revenue model is this. Our reader revenue model enables readers to voluntarily contribute to The Guardian so that our journalism remains open and accessible to anyone, regardless of where they live or what they can afford. I think sometimes it's easier to make sense of the model by putting its operating principles vis-a-vis a traditional paywall. So a paywall requires you to pay, and our supporter model is enabled through voluntary support. A paywall restricts access to those who pay, and our supporter model keeps journalism open and accessible to everyone. A paywall sets the price. Our supporter model lets individuals support us however they'd like, no matter how big or small. And a paywall can be one-to-one between publisher and reader, whereas the supporter model is one-to-many, offering one person the ability to provide others access to quality, independent journalism. Philosophically, you can argue that whereas a paywall benefits in a world of scarcity, we have introduced, we hope, a model grounded in reciprocity. I have to say and emphasize that readers don't give or support us for nothing. They support us for the quality of our journalism, both in its breadth and depth, and they support us so that others may access that journalism. There's an economics expression for relationships like this, sometimes referred to as a non-dollar exchange. Those are situations in which the value cannot be converted simply into dollars. And yes, while we certainly have readers who support The Guardian so that they themselves feel better about it, it's true, but for many, the reasons go beyond this. So, what makes up reader revenues? We call it the supporter model. There are several ways that you can contribute to The Guardian. So the primary is over on the left, contributions, single, monthly, annual, as well as contributions made in support of a series or reporting endeavor. And on the right, you have subscriptions. Now, subscriptions often mean that content is put behind a paywall, but in our case, the subscriptions offer you a different way of experiencing the journalism itself, and I'll provide some examples of that in a moment. And in the middle, you have membership. This was an early program that we introduced, and we still support, but no longer actively promote. So when it comes to subscriptions, you can look at our app as an example. You can become a premium tier app subscriber and gain access to curatorial features like Live and Discover. Live gives you minute-by-minute updates and links to our news stories. And Discover is a bit like a journalistic chat roulette, pointing you to fantastic features and interviews and profiles. And options like the premium tier are fantastic for readers who really care how Guardian journalism is delivered. Again, none of our subscriptions put the journalism behind a paywall, but they change how you access and experience it. So our approach initially made us the subject of mockery. Many said that we were begging. This is a cartoon that was published in the Private Eye, a satirical journal, shortly after we began experimenting. This is a cartoon that I remember made several of my colleagues feel very uncomfortable with the direction that we had taken. And to be fair, we didn't know whether it would work. It was really nerve-wracking. You saw the numbers that I shared with you earlier, and you're familiar with the economics of journalism. The question that we faced was, would readers pay for something they were accustomed to getting for free, and that they would continue to get for free? But last autumn, we announced that more than 1 million people around the globe have supported us, and we have set our sights on a new goal, reaching 2 million supporters in the next 3 years. It's also the case that reader revenues are now larger than advertising revenues at The Guardian. So I mentioned earlier that I came up and through new media. And so now I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we made this happen at an institution like The Guardian. And it really comes down to, no surprise, hard work. Initially, we committed to research, experimentation, and collaboration. And when you look back and sort of in hindsight, things always look both neater and messier. They're neater because you know what truly made the difference. You can see those sorts of pivots and changes in your work that took you to a new place, the step changes and improvements. But it's also messy because there's often so much that you tried that didn't work. And frankly, there are things that you tried that did work, and sometimes because of luck or chance. It's not always clear what you can and can't take credit for. When we began experimenting with contributions, we tried all sorts of ways of asking readers for support. So many little experiments failed. I remember at one point we introduced a little love button that no one clicked on. It was a bit like an unopened Valentine on the site. So here's a simple timeline of some of the changes in our evolution. So in 2014, we launched an events-based membership program. And the program itself was based in the UK, and it spoke to a readership that very much wanted to attend events with Guardian journalists. And while it was popular with local readers, understandably, it wasn't a scalable model. So we began to look elsewhere. I mentioned earlier that 2/3 of our audience is outside of the UK. So it's really important to us that we found an approach that would work with our global readership. So over the next few years, we began to tinker with ways to build a voluntary support program, which has evolved into a contribution scheme. Then in 2017, our editor-in-chief published the piece that I mentioned earlier, A Mission for Journalism in Times of Crisis, in which she outlined those 5 principles, both for the newsroom and the institution. And this is a really critical piece for us. It was a first, I think, public step in establishing and establishing our broader journalistic mission in a way that our readers both could understand and appreciate. Once we had the contributions program, we began fixating and obsessing on improving it. We tried tailoring it to our readership around the globe. We experimented in different regions, like with an end-of-year appeal in the US, or allowing readers in the US to contribute to specific journalistic series. And more recently, we have been revising our digital subscriptions offering, launching the premium tier of the app, a fantastic new Guardian Weekly, and last week, actually, a daily edition for the UK. So we have a mixed revenue model, advertising on one side, reader revenues on the other, with both digital subscriptions and contributions. The timeline looks nice and neat, but the improvement and change wasn't linear, all ups and downs, back and forth. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what made a difference to us organizationally. So the first is that we adopted what are called OKRs. OKRs stand for Objectives and Key Results. The practice was originally introduced, I believe, at Intel and then was adopted by Google. And this is a management practice that asks the team to set an objective for a dedicated period of time. In our case, that's a quarter. We work on a quarterly basis. And the objective is like a North Star. It's a sort of higher order goal. An example could be respect and recognize repeat contributors. These are people who give multiple times. And then the team is asked to create a list of what are called key results. These are both discrete and measurable outcomes that you would expect if you're headed in the right direction. So if you imagine that you're traveling to that North Star, those metrics are like signs of success on the way. So for example, it could be testing 5 prototypes for a new channel or increasing the conversion rate by 5%. We adopted these at The Guardian about 3 years ago, and they injected so much energy into the organization. And all of a sudden, across the organization, we were debating what we were doing and why we were doing it. It lended transparency to how the resources were allocated across the organization. And we had this real sense of going somewhere together. And if you're like me, I'm very goal-oriented. I really loved the debate and then the direction that this practice offered. Then 2, you can look at our most powerful channel. It's located at the end of an article, which is where we know readers, when we know readers are more likely to support us. It's not highly designed, it's conversational, often beginning with a "since you're here." Actually, many times when I meet people and they find out what I do at The Guardian, they will invariably say, "Oh, so you, you have something to do with the little yellow box at the end of an article." But I think what's important for you to know is that shifting the requests for support outside of the advertising units and into the journalistic space was a game changer for us. And for me, this is something that I think newsrooms really need to fixate on, how it is that you're to design your site, how it is you design your platform, so that you really can have these deeper relationships with your readers. Where is it that you can tell the stories about your work in a way that has place and meaning? And then much like the organizations that you've heard from, I think particularly with Uppity and Unique, we have committed to research. And as a news organization, we're really skilled at telling stories about other people, other organizations, outside events. But the last few years have really taught us that we had to learn to tell our own story, and that telling our own story was really critical, both to our success and also to establishing a new model that would make sense to our readers. So we committed to research, and on this slide I refer to the window in the mirror. What I'd like to say to my team is that the research enables us to more candidly see ourselves, like it shows our faults, our failures, our problems, also what people value about us, but it should also help us better contextualize our work, much more than simply making sense of what's on our homepage. As a principal, it's very hard when you're faced with so much that you have to do to figure out where to focus. So we also made a decision to keep things as simple as possible and only make them more complex when we were actually serving readers' needs. So take, for example, some of the differences that began to emerge in contributions. Readers in the US contribute very differently than readers, for example, in Europe. In the UK, many people are accustomed to a monthly, not just subscription service, but monthly payments that they use, making direct debit. Whereas for many of our readers in the US who might not have some of the same protections on their cards or are more accustomed to single contributions, that is their preferred method. We also used the research to really make sense of what the different contribution methods meant and how we could make them easier to our readers. What you're looking at here is what we call a behavioral portrait. It's a sketch of the needs of our single contributors. And what we learned from many of them is that they like to give single contributions because, one, they actually may enjoy the act of giving. They like it so much that they don't want the money to voluntarily come out of their account. But two, for others, they're concerned about their data privacy and security. So knowing what their needs are enables us to make improvements that work for them. And here you can see a portrait we have of recurring contributors. We hear from readers, for example, that they prefer this because it's one and done. They like having that knowledge that the money is just being withdrawn from their bank account without having to make much more of an effort. Until we talked to our readers, it was really easy to see these choices between single and recurring contributions, frankly, as more of a superficial choice. But once we've talked to readers, we better understand why they make these decisions and how. And then lastly, we've also paid a lot of attention to what readers truly value in our work, like the coverage of the environment and our investigative reporting. So I've invoked our readers often. What have they told us about the model? Here are some quotes that we have heard from our readers. There's some, I think, that speak to this more than others. Catherine Viner's article on reaching 1 million contributors convinced me that this is a viable model, not just feel-good icing on a tough cake. I want to support journalism and democracy in an effective way. You have me on board. To me, it simply feels so good and so important to contribute to journalism that everyone can have access to, rather than simply pay to access content behind a paywall that only people who pay are able to access. It's a very small way of helping to spread the wealth more evenly in the world, and it's great to feel part of a million-strong community that feels the same as I do. And as a creative person, I know that a person deserves to be paid fairly for the work that they do. The Guardian offers amazing content that I know I can trust, and while I can't handle a monthly donation with the money I'm making right now, I wanted to send a token of appreciation to you. Where to next? So we are focused on becoming supporter-led, making sense of what it means to be a more purposeful and directly support and reader revenue supported organization. I showed you a timeline earlier, and I'm going to show you now some recent events, The Guardian, that bring this to light. So this is our September brand campaign. It's titled Hope is Power, and the campaign was meant to reflect the mission laid out from our editor-in-chief, and it's meant to be a bit of a progressive rallying call for action. So.
Why the struggle, why the strain? Why make trouble, why make scenes? Why go against the grain? Why swim upstream? It ain't no use. You're bound to lose. What's done is done. That's the way the river runs. So why get wet? Why break the sweat? Why waste your precious breath? Nothing changes, nothing changes, nothing.
Oh no. How do I get out? Stop.
Welcome.
That was not part of the presentation. And that ad played during the Great British Bake Off and was also on billboards in England. We also acquired B Corp accreditation. And getting this accreditation requires us to consider the impact of our work and the decisions on workers, customers, suppliers, community, and the environment. This is a license that requires us to audit our behavior and publicly publish the results on an annual basis. The B Corp license is intended to create a community of businesses and organizations that are committed to a more sustainable economy. And then last week, we announced our new environmental pledge. This pledge makes 5 commitments, both to ourselves and to our readers, including 1, continue dedicating resources to our environmental reporting on how the environmental collapse is affecting people around the world, including natural disasters and extreme weather events. And Kath, our editor-in-chief, said we will undertake investigations into the economic and political structures that underpin the carbon economy and examine the role that climate plays in other critical issues, including inequality, migration, and the battle over scarce resources. We have committed to using language that recognizes the severity of the crisis, so following recommendations from scientists, as well as aiming for net zero emissions by 2030, both for our newsroom and for The Guardian as a whole, and to be transparent with our progress. The B Corp license is a critical way of doing this. We're thrilled with the progress that we've made, but honestly, there is so much more room left for improvement. When I was listening to people on stage during the earlier chat, many of them were talking about the feedback that you get from both your readers and supporters, which I am very much familiar with. So in our case, we know that we need to improve the supporter experience, making sure that we can better identify supporters on the site so that they don't get asked too often to support us. In our case, this is actually quite difficult. Many organizations manage this through a paywall, simply allowing access only to those who pay. But in our case, we want to keep the journalism open. We also abide by GDPR, which is a European regulation, a very good one, but also means that we have to be incredibly sensitive and protective of people's data when we do it. 2, I mentioned that our base is incredibly global. We have to make sure it's easy for anyone, anywhere to support us, and to make sure that our customer service is also accessible regardless of where someone is. I think it's fair to say that we've become more comfortable with the idea that life or the times will be indefinitely uncertain. The advertising revenues do continue to shift away from publishers and towards the tech giants. Partisanship is on the rise. Fake news gets confused for the news, and as we've discussed, many people don't trust journalists to deliver the truth. And then in the UK, there's also Brexit. But we're hopeful. We're hopeful that we can do more and do better with the backing of our readers and supporters. Thank you.